All right, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you so much to everyone for joining us here today. It's wonderful to see so many familiar names and new names on the webinar today. This webinar is hosted by the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center, which is based here at the University of Colorado Boulder. My name is Heather Yoakum. I'm the social science lead here at the NC-CASC, and I co-host this webinar with my colleague Imtiaz Rangwala and the other folks here at the center. So we bring you these webinars to facilitate a discussion of science, research, and best practices related to adaptation and resource management under a rapidly changing climate and other environmental changes, with a focus on the north central US that encompasses the Missouri and Upper Colorado River basins, the Northern Rockies, and the Northern Great Plains. So before I introduce our speakers today, just some quick logistics for the webinar. We are recording this webinar, and you can find all of our previous recordings on our website and also on our NCCASC YouTube channel. And so during the webinar, all participants will be muted, so keep on mute, but you'll be able to unmute during the Q&A at the end of the presentation. If you have questions or comments at any time during the webinar, please feel free to drop them in the chat. Imtiaz and I will be watching that, and we will put them to our speakers at the end of the presentation and before we kind of open it up for other folks to ask questions during the Q&A. We'll end the formal part of the webinar at noon, so we'll stop the recording. And then after that, anyone who kind of wants to stick around for about 15 more minutes for kind of an informal discussion with our speakers is really encouraged to do so. Those can be really fun times. And so now I am really pleased to introduce our two speakers for today, Dr. Kira Hefty and Dr. Jacqueline Fox-Rushing. Dr. Hefty is the forest biologist on the Pumice National Forest in Northern California. She studies wildlife distribution, diversity, and connectivity in changing landscapes. From forested wetlands to rangelands and high elevation conifer forests, Kira has worked with managers to develop and assess management strategies in regions highly affected by acute disturbance, like wildfires, as well as regions experiencing prolonged landscape change and ecological transformations. During her time with the Aldo Leopold Wilderness Research Institute, Kira led research and workshops in collaboration with multiple federal agencies and their diverse partners to develop situations to climate change-driven ecological transformation using adaptive management and the Resist, Accept, Direct, or RAD framework. Kira has a master's in biology from the University of Nevada, Reno, and a PhD in wildlife conservation and management from the University of Arizona in Tucson. And Jacqueline Fox-Rushing is a social scientist with the Forest Service at the Aldo Leopold Wilderness Research Institute. Which is cool because it's the only federal research program dedicated to supporting the National Wilderness Preservation System. As such, the scope of the center's work is national and interagency. Jacqueline's research largely falls into two focus areas. First, the recreation research, so looking at the public's relationships and experiences with recreation and the management of public lands for recreation. And second, looking at organizations' adaptation to social and environmental change. So, for example, responding to increasing recreation, the frequency of high intensity fire, and then those larger ecological transformations. Jacqueline has a PhD in forest and conservation sciences from the University of Montana. So we are so pleased to have you both with us today. And with that, Jacqueline and Kira, I'll hand it to you.
Thank you so much, Heather, and thank you too to Imtiaz for inviting us here today. And for those great introductions. I also want to call out that this work was really supported, what we're sharing with you all today, by a range of folks at the North Central CASC, including Imtiaz and Kira Clark-Wolf, folks from Colorado Mesa University, particularly Dr. Weeks, and then folks from other folks from the Forest Service, Bureau of Land Management, and U.S. Geological Survey. So we're really excited to share the results from one of 4 case studies with you here today. This is part of a broader project called the RAD Decision in RAD Landscapes project. And this project looks at ecological transformation within our wilderness ecosystems in the U.S. At different wilderness areas across the contiguous United States, administered by different agencies. And what we'll be sharing with you today is results in particular from the Black Ridge Canyons Wilderness case study, which is administered by the Bureau of Land Management. So I'm going to get us kicked off by really grounding us within the wilderness context. The Wilderness Act of 1964 is the enabling legislation, and it was passed to protect landscapes from the impacts of human development. This act also established the National Wilderness Preservation System, which is administered by our 4 largest federal land management agencies: Park Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, BLM, and Forest Service. The primary mandate of the Wilderness Act is to preserve wilderness character, which is not defined within the legislation, but has come to be interpreted as a holistic concept that encompasses the relationships among biophysical, experiential, and symbolic ideals. To monitor wilderness character and how we are preserving it over time, the agencies interpreted it to include 5 distinct qualities, 2 of which we're really going to focus on here today: the idea of being untrammeled or without intentional human manipulation of the ecosystem, and natural or primarily affected by the forces of nature, and maintaining that historic ecological character and influence. Additionally, wilderness protects undeveloped landscapes without permanent human habitation or signs of it, opportunities for solitude or primitive and unconfined recreation, and other place-specific unique features of value, as well as opportunities to engage in science and education. As of today, there are 806 wilderness areas, about 111 million acres of land. Bureau of Land Management in particular is responsible for 263 wilderness areas, encompassing about 10 million acres in 10 states. And this idea of natural and untrammeled and managing wilderness so as to optimize both a landscape where we're taking a relatively hands-off approach to ecological management and allowing natural systems to flourish is really fraught, especially in an era of ecological transformation. Ecological transformation is the emergence of a new or novel ecological community that's triggered by acute, prolonged, or compounding disturbance effects. And it's really defined by a permanent alteration in species composition, structure, or function. And our transforming ecological systems present a really big challenge in natural resource management today, because the emergence of new or novel communities can be really difficult to predict and can act as a moving target for managers who are attempting to, meet goals for the landscapes they steward and prescribe management activities to do that. And as I mentioned, there is increasing tension in an era of anthropogenic climate change and transformations as a result between managing wilderness as untrammeled and as natural. And we all know climate change is a really diffuse problem that you can't control within administrative boundaries, and it is at least exacerbated by human development. And we know that there is a lot of ambiguity within the Wilderness Act. Among these 5 qualities, there is no prescription about which ones we prioritize, and so managers have a lot of room for discretion of how they might respond to ecological transformation. And so it puts managers in a very difficult situation where we have to ask ourselves, do we have a responsibility to intervene on behalf of the species and the systems, or to very intentionally not intervene and maintain these lands as untrammeled in the case of wilderness? And we claim that this dilemma is actually really a wicked problem. And if naturalness means maintaining our historic ecosystem structure and function, then trammeling may be warranted to preserve naturalness. And although active management is not prohibited within wilderness, active management activities are really highly scrutinized. And so managers really need to demonstrate that they are doing the minimal actions necessary to preserve wilderness character using the minimum allowable tools. So instead of chainsaws, maybe we're using hand saws, or instead of flying in with a helicopter, we're packing in with stock or hiking in on foot. And we're really trying to minimize impacts to other qualities of wilderness character in our actions. And anytime we are engaging in active management in wilderness, there is a distinct risk of litigation and public outcry. And so, again, this is a wicked problem because there is no right or wrong answer. We do really need to be intentional and mindful about how we respond to climate change-driven transformations, and carefully weigh the trade-offs associated with our response alternatives, and be very transparent about that. And using the best available science and decision support frameworks can really help managers make really robust and defensible decisions. And so one framework that we can use to do this is the Resist, Accept, Direct framework, which is a decision support tool that really illuminates the full decision space when it comes to responding to ecological transformation. And this framework kind of posits there's three main ways in which we could respond to transformation. We could resist it, or work to maintain current conditions, or restore historical conditions related to ecosystem composition, structure, or function. We could accept the transformation and not intervene and allow ecosystems to change autonomously, or as they would without our help. And then we can direct the change by actively shaping it toward a preferred new condition. So for instance, if we have a forested system and future conditions are not suitable for the current tree species, we could introduce more climate adaptive species to maintain that forest structure as opposed to converting to, say, a grassland.
So like Jacqueline mentioned earlier in our talk, the case study that we're presenting on today for the Black Ridge Canyons Wilderness is one of 4 case studies that we had as part of the larger project, the RAD Decisions and RAD Landscapes project, where we really sought to help managers kind of grapple and untangle this wicked problem that Jacqueline is describing of how do we decide whether or not to intervene with the ecological transformation with active management to either resist that change that we're seeing on the landscape, accept it and let it continue without any intervention, or direct it towards potentially a more desirable future that helps us meet some of our goals and objectives for the landscapes that we manage. And the reason why we picked the RAD framework in particular, because there are a number of frameworks that you can choose that help you make these decisions surrounding climate change and ecological restoration, is that it has that accept piece. So that actually gives managers the ability to explicitly evaluate trade-offs with letting the transformation continue, which may be or traditionally has been the default within wilderness areas because active management is so highly scrutinized. But instead of defaulting to that accept strategy, we're really trying to evaluate the trade-offs with accepting ecological transformation as compared to actively intervening. And so we sought to go through this exercise and answer these questions and help managers grapple with this problem across these 4 case studies, one per wilderness administering agency, so Bureau of Land Management. With the Black Ridge Canyons Wilderness, we also worked with the National Park Service on ALWRI, the Fish and Wildlife Service in Cabeza Prieta and Cofa, National Wildlife Refuges, with pronghorns, Northern pronghorn as our study species. And then with the Forest Service for whitebark pine, which involved a number of agencies because this species is so widespread, but with whitebark pine kind of being that focal species. Go ahead. So for the Black Ridge Canyons Wilderness more specifically, this is a really interesting landscape. It's in western Colorado. If you're not familiar, it's a pretty arid landscape characterized by these heavy rainfalls in the summertime and winter snowfall. These areas receive a good amount of recreation use because the Colorado River borders the northern boundary of the Black Ridge Canyons wilderness. It's a little bit difficult to get in. Most people access the wilderness from the river. So this is arid Colorado Plateau, like I mentioned. And within the canyon systems themselves, and the system that we really focused on for this case study are these ephemeral streams and pools where these native amphibian species exist. And that includes a whole host of species, but the ones that we really focused on for this case study included the Woodhouse's toad, red-spotted toad, and the canyon tree frog. And to really use RAD as a tool to try to expand this decision space around what we might do to try to conserve these native species through climate change-driven ecological transformation, we used a combination of an adaptive management process with RAD kind of inserted into that process as a tool to illuminate a decision space for managers. So the pieces of this wheel that we directly worked on with managers, both before a workshop and as well as during a 2-day in-person workshop with managers on site in Colorado, was clarifying how we feel this landscape is changing with climate change-driven ecological transformation, work with managers to identify their values and desired conditions for this wilderness area, how those values and desired conditions might be impacted by anticipated ecological transformation, expanding that decision space. This is kind of where RAD came in to evaluate the kinds of decisions that we might pursue to address that ecological transformation, and then evaluate the trade-offs associated with a number of those decisions. And then there are, of course, for this adaptive management wheel, a couple of steps intended for managers post-workshop and post this project, where they would then select a decision or multiple decisions to pursue, implement those in the field and monitor, and then kind of reevaluate after a certain amount of time to see if those decisions are effective in reaching their desired conditions. And so one of the first things that we attempted to do with managers was try to ask them how they are both perceiving climate change threats in the Black Ridge Canyons wilderness, and also conduct some analyses and evaluate how these systems might be changing in the future. Some of the threats were fairly known and are already being observed within the Black Ridge Canyons wilderness, and some of the ecological threats include the invasive American bullfrog, which can spread BD, the precursor of chytrid fungus, which is a disease that can cause high mortality rates in native species. American bullfrogs can also outcompete smaller native species for habitat, and they can also directly predate these native species. So this has been a big threat within this wilderness area that managers continue to address. Additionally, there are a number of non-native invasive plant species within this system as well that is a concern, including cheatgrass and tamarisk, which have the ability to both change kind of the hydrology of the habitat that these species live within, as well as the wildfire cycle within and surrounding this habitat. So some ways that climate change is changing and anticipated to continue to change. Again, habitat for these native species includes increasing temperatures kind of across the board, fluctuating precipitation patterns, change in climatic water deficit and vapor pressure deficit, so things just kind of getting drier potentially over time. And that sort of coupled with some of the ecological threats mentioned earlier, we have increasing the potential for increased wildfire potential and intensity, and the facilitated spread of these non-native plant and animal species into native habitat for these amphibians. So together, these ecological stressors, the non-native species, coupled with some of these climate pressures, can lead to pretty rapidly ecological transformation, where we've essentially reached this tipping point or this threshold where these systems either will take an incredible amount of active management intensity to return these systems back to what they used to be, or it might make trying to get these systems to return to a historical condition not feasible.
So once we did these investigations, we gathered folks together for a 2-day in-person workshop, as Kira mentioned. Participants in the workshop included local National Conservation and Area and Wilderness managers from Bureau of Land Management, as well as BLM wilderness folks at national levels and state levels. Additionally, nonprofit partners were included and university subject matter experts who do work in the wilderness. And the first thing that we did at the workshop was identify values and desired conditions for the wilderness area. And participants came up with all kinds of different values, and we grouped those into these 4 themes. Recreation. The Black Ridge Canyons offers unique recreational opportunities because it fosters feelings of solitude and remoteness while being very proximate to Grand Junction. Natural communities and features. The Black Ridge Canyons provide really viable, defensible habitat for wildlife and has really special, unique geologic features. Education and connection to place. The wilderness offers really outstanding opportunities for education, community outreach, volunteer stewardship, and these opportunities foster a lot of community support and place attachment and interest in stewardship of the wilderness. And participants really talked about the canyons as an inspirational space, particularly for inspiring new art and science. And then based on these values, we came up with a bunch of desired conditions, again, grouped into these 3 main themes. One is maintaining thriving populations of native flora and fauna. These species are important for the historical natural quality of the wilderness. Additionally, participants wanted Black Ridge Canyons to be leaders of innovative management, really focusing on proactive planning and management grounded in best available science and supported by partnerships, as opposed to being reactionary. And the third desired condition was keeping wilderness wild. So balancing the encouragement of recreation and educational opportunities while also protecting opportunities for solitude experiences and viable, defensible habitat for vulnerable ecosystems.
Additionally, prior to the workshop, in addition to kind of evaluating how ecological transformation is being observed in the system, but both by managers as well as recreationists, we also did kind of took more of a quantitative look as well and had a discussion about how the system might change in the future. And Jacqueline, I don't know if everyone's seeing this, but I don't see the PowerPoint slide anymore. I just see your background.
Yep, also only see the, oh, there it is.
There it is, thank you. So you can go to the next slide. And so prior to the workshop, we actually engaged in some discussions and took, again, kind of this hard look at how this system might change or might transform into the future. And folks like Imtiaz, Kira Clark-Wolf from the North Central CASC system were really key to helping us develop kind of the basis of the conversation, which is looking at climate change projections and then inferring with this broader team of experts, which included subject matter experts from University of Colorado Mesa, as well as other managers and partners, to understand how climate change trends might influence habitat and ecology within these canyon systems, and specifically for native amphibian species. And so together with this team of experts, we used the climate toolbox, specifically the future climate scenarios tool within the climate toolbox, to generate 3 divergent kind of climate futures for the Black Ridge Canyons wilderness. And one of those futures was a warmer and wetter future. And again, these were projected to 2 different time periods, kind of mid-century as well as end of century 2100, in reference to or as compared to historical conditions from mean historical conditions from 1971 to 2000. And so relative to those historical conditions, we had a warmer and wetter future, a hotter future where precipitation patterns didn't fluctuate more than roughly 5% from those historical means, and then a hot and dry future where overall things are becoming much hotter and much drier. And we use those scenarios kind of as the basis for conversation to then consult with those subject matter experts and infer how we think or how we might anticipate ecological conditions within the canyons might change into the future. So go ahead, Jacqueline. And I'll try to be quick about this because we could have a 40-minute presentation just on this analysis. But we looked at this kind of at 2 different spatial scales. One was a landscape scale. So what's happening surrounding this really critical habitat for these amphibian species, what we anticipate is going to change that could then influence conditions within these ephemeral pools themselves. So that's what you're seeing in these 2 images. These are kind of the historical conditions that we're representing in these images, both at the landscape scale, some of the threats we're seeing. So you can see maybe a little tiny bullfrog on the plateau there. We have some cattle grazing. We have somebody recreating on the river, as well as some fire over there in the distance. And then current conditions kind of at the scale of individual pools. We have one big fat bullfrog in the pool there and some of our native canyon tree frogs, red-spotted toads, and woodhouses toads surrounding the pool, as well as native willows as well within that riparian habitat. So these are kind of our historical conditions where we do have threats currently on the landscape. Go ahead, Jacqueline. And so we had these 3, again, different future scenarios, this warmer and wetter hot scenario and a hot dry scenario. And the temperature bulb and the raindrop kind of indicate how temperature and precipitation patterns are expected to fluctuate, again, using tools from that climate toolbox as compared to historical levels today. And so this, again, backing up, looking at the landscape level in sort of this warmer and wetter future, we expected that there would be more wildfire on the plateau surrounding this ephemeral habitat. But we would still have some native species, so those wetter conditions can encourage the persistence of native riparian vegetation or plant species. But because we're getting this flush of greenery every year from wetter conditions, we're expecting to see more wildfire and bullfrogs persist at the landscape level. In a hotter scenario where precipitation isn't changing as much, we're still expecting to see more wildfire at the landscape level, but less persistence of native vegetation. And in the hot, dry scenario, we're seeing the proliferation of more of these non-native invasive upland species, such as cheatgrass and tamarisk, kind of moving into these riparian areas where native frogs exist, and perhaps actually less fire in this scenario because you just don't have the same vegetation or flush of vegetation in that wetter scenario. Go ahead. And so with these changing conditions at the landscape level, this is kind of how we anticipated those changes would either indirectly influence habitat conditions at this local level, as well as just generally how we expect these local habitat conditions to change under each of these scenarios. So again, under the warmer and wetter scenario, because we still have kind of this persistent long or longer hydro period for water in the system, we do expect that bullfrogs will be able to move into the canyon systems, potentially farther into the canyon systems than they have in the past, just because there's more water available to them. Bullfrogs are really dependent on this perennial water in order to persist. And so there might be some they might outcompete native amphibians in the system under this scenario. In the hot scenario, we still have some native amphibians on the landscape, but we're starting to lose some of that native riparian vegetation, as well as we're getting a lot less, our hydro periods are much shorter. So it's more difficult perhaps for the bullfrogs to move into the native habitat for native amphibians. However, there's just less habitat overall. Hot dry scenario is kind of the most extreme scenario that we expected for native amphibians. We're not really seeing invasive bullfrogs or anticipating seeing native bullfrogs in this scenario, but we do have kind of at this point the replacement of native riparian vegetation by upland, non-native upland species, and just an extreme loss of habitat, really low hydro period for native species in this scenario. So overall, it can be kind of difficult to wrap our heads around all these different potential futures. And so we tried to distill all of these range of futures down to a few key themes that really emphasized key ecological transformations that we might expect to see across all scenarios for managers during the workshop. And so some of these key ecological transformations we're not seeing as much of a change in the direction and differences in the direction of change rather, but more in the magnitude of change that we're expecting to see on the landscape. And so commonly across these different scenarios, we're expecting that there's going to be some level of conversion of these native riparian communities to upland communities, conversion of native vegetation to annual and riparian invasive dominated communities, conversion of winter snow to winter rain, so just less snowpack, and we're getting kind of more extreme runoff events in the summertime or springtime, and a trend towards higher intensity disturbance events, including wildfire and these summer convective storms. Go ahead. And altogether, these environmental or ecological transformation themes are expected to have both proximate consequences to native amphibians, including heightened disease transmission due to higher population densities or invasion by bullfrogs, increased competition, and decreased recruitment of these native populations. And ultimately, those could lead to decreased native species richness, genetic drift, and decreased heterozygosity, and local or widespread extirpation of these native amphibians from these ephemeral pool systems.
Are you still seeing my slides?
Your background is starting to creep in a little bit.
That's so weird. How about now? Are we good?
You're good now, I think.
So we presented all of these scenarios and kind of key findings that Kira just shared with you to participants at the workshop. And we asked them to generate and brainstorm any and all response options that they could take responding to these changes. And we didn't introduce RAD until after they had kind of come up with a whole suite of ideas of ways in which they could respond. Then we introduced the RAD framework to the participants, and we had them categorize each of the response options as resist, accept, and or direct. And as you can see here, participants came up with several strategies to resist the transformation, really focusing on water retention, restoration of native species, removal of non-native and invasive species, and grazing management. Strategies that singularly accepted the transformation focused on monitoring change. So not do nothing, but learn and monitor the change, just not intervene quite yet. And then strategies to direct the transformation included species relocation and creating new habitat outside of wilderness. I'll give you a minute to look those over. And then once we had come up with all of these different alternatives, we asked participants to choose three. One resist, one accept, and one direct that we would then evaluate further. And it was really important that these strategies be very specific. And so we had participants really hone in on what are the nitty-gritty details of actually pursuing this resist strategy, for instance. So our resist strategy that we selected was removing bullfrogs from upstream source populations on public and private land within both within and outside the National Conservation Area, including wilderness. The removal of bullfrogs included capture and removal from the system and termination. The capture methods included netting or hand capturing of any age class of bullfrog, and access included a diverse range of options depending on the land designation. So options included floating in and up the canyons into wilderness, walking across land at the top of the canyons into wilderness, and on other areas of the National Conservation Area, and then accessing via road for private lands. Accept was in lieu of implementing an active management strategy. We were going to fund and support the monitoring of changing ecological conditions. And that work would include audio inventory and temporary installation for up to 5 years of ecological monitoring equipment like temperature loggers, acoustic monitors, and water depth sensors. And this would necessitate traveling to monitoring sites about 3 times per year. And we would access the sites from the river. So float in along the Colorado and then hike up the canyons. And then the direct strategy was to move native amphibians to other water sources, both within and outside the conservation area that are not currently occupied by these native species. This option still requires the removal of bullfrogs using the methods outlined in the resist strategy. And they would collect about 30% of the wilderness populations from viable native amphibian populations, collecting tadpoles only. And then there would be a combined introduction strategy of directly introducing tadpoles to new habitats and then observing them in a controlled tank environment. And then we evaluated each of these strategies further to understand what are all of the social, ecological, ethical, legal trade-offs associated with each. And to do that, we used a futures wheel approach, wherein you put your decision or your change at the center of the wheel, and then you brainstorm all of the direct consequences or implications of that change. So if we do X, then Y will happen or could happen. And so that's all of the orange dots around the blue one. And then once you have all of your first order consequences outlined, you think about what are all the direct consequences or implications of those things. And so you identify all of those, which is the brighter yellow dots, and then so on and so forth down the chain. And what this does is really illuminate all of the potential implications and consequences and starts to reduce uncertainty in what may happen if you pursued a decision alternative. It also shows, really transparent consideration of the trade-offs associated with the action. And then after we kind of identified all of these potential implications or trade-offs, we scored them for likelihood and desirability. And likelihood was scored as from 1, extremely unlikely, to 9, extremely likely this will happen. And then desirability was scored on a weighted scale from -50, this would be a catastrophe, to +50, this would be a triumph or a breakthrough. And so, again, this allows us to kind of capture areas of uncertainty, reduce unintended consequences, and then assess cumulative impacts of resist, accept, and direct decisions by scoring the implications. And this is what we found, some of our wheels here. I'm not going to go into explicit detail on each of these. The slides will be available after the presentation for you to take a peek at, and I think we'll drop a link to the report in the chat. but I will go over some of the key findings. So for resist and for all of the futures wheels, we really encouraged participants to think about all of the potential consequences, not just ecological ones. So what will this mean for wilderness character? What will this mean for recreationists to the area? What will this mean for you as managers needing to do the work? What could this mean for public perceptions? And so we really tried to capture all of the range of potential implications coming from these decisions. This is our accept wheel. Some notable things in here is, we're thinking about doing data collection. So how would having these temperature, water depth, and acoustic loggers in the wilderness impact wilderness character? Is there a risk of those getting flooded out? Is there a risk of them being vandalized by the public? What kinds of policies and procedures need to be followed? Do we need to do a NEPA analysis or minimum requirements analysis to do this work? And then what are the ecological risks of not intervening? That might look like increased disease among native amphibians, a decrease in our native amphibians, and ultimately perhaps a failure to meet our wilderness objectives. And for direct, again, really thinking about, well, what if we spread disease to these new areas? What are going to be the ecological implications of introducing species to areas where they weren't before? This is a research opportunity. That's really cool. So thinking about all kinds of different things, these white bubbles here weren't put into order as a first, second, third order implication, but they were things that people had thought about as potential consequences or implications of pursuing this strategy. And across all three of these futures wheels and strategies, what we found was that resistance through bullfrog removal may be a more desirable short-term strategy, but it doesn't address the longer-term threats such as climate change-driven habitat transformation. The accept strategy was determined to be a really appropriate interim solution with an emphasis on more precise species and habitat monitoring to inform any future decision to resist, accept, or direct the change. And although several of the potential implications of the direct strategy were considered undesirable, participants felt that it may be the most effective at conserving native species over time through climate change. And none of the decision alternatives were rated as highly likely nor highly unlikely. And this really indicates that there was a high degree of uncertainty in anticipated outcomes for any of the alternatives.
And so overall, we felt, or participants felt, that these tools were useful. They're certainly time consuming. They take quite a bit of time. Our workshops were 2 full days. The futures wheel alone was 1 full day trying to grapple with these decisions. But it did generate a lot of interesting discussions and got people to really focus their decisions on climate change driven ecological transformation, which can be difficult to predict and difficult to prepare for and respond to. Across the board, across all of our case studies, climate change is happening everywhere. The intensity of effects or what they're seeing or observing on the landscape changes a little bit between our case studies. ALWRI is kind of buffered by Lake Superior, managed by the National Park Service. They're seeing some changes on the landscape, but not quite as extreme as some of the changes that managers are observing, for example, in the Black Ridge Canyons wilderness. So the sense of urgency to address these changes or transformations varied a little bit among different partners or different case studies, particularly when we're thinking about these actions or potential actions within wilderness. Generally, there was a preference for resist strategies. These strategies tend to be very familiar to managers when we're thinking about restoration activities. These are activities that are highly practiced by managers on a regular basis. So we're very familiar and confident in what the potential outcomes of those activities will look like. And so there was a little bit more comfort around these resist strategies among all of our case studies. However, there was a recognition that over time, these resist strategies and the outcomes we're seeing from them may no longer be predictable as the landscape changes. And so there was a recognition that, kind of considering or at least having direct options on the table was something that managers were willing to consider. However, choosing direct options, which are far less practiced than resist, for example, there's more uncertainty with what the outcomes will look like. And so there was a higher level of hesitancy to choose these direct strategies or select these direct strategies, but a larger recognition that they may be necessary moving forward. And accept strategies managers felt were still valuable. Of course, a lot of these accept strategies don't allow us to meet some of our desired conditions for the landscapes that we manage. However, they do allow us to avoid trammeling within wilderness, which is a value or character quality of wilderness that we seek to preserve. So accept strategies such as monitoring and research can still be valuable, particularly if we are considering direct options that we're less familiar with. So having that extra data, that extra research kind of prior to engaging in these direct strategies is still valuable to inform future decisions. Go ahead. And again, these futures wheels, in addition to looking at these different RAD strategies, were helpful in evaluating the trade-offs among resist, accept, and direct options. These were particularly time-consuming. Like I said, they took a full day just to go through these futures wheels, but folks did find them valuable in kind of clarifying the trade-offs among these different decisions. For the Black Ridge Canyons wilderness in particular, something that popped up was this need to identify triggers and tipping points for which to switch from, let's say, a resist to a direct scenario. What is the appropriate time to do so? And so there's some future work that needs to be done to develop these tipping points that indicate when we should switch from one decision to another. And overall, across the case studies, managers and their partners really wanted a little bit more clarity. This wasn't as relevant to Black Ridge Canyons wilderness because we didn't have any threatened and endangered species. These native amphibians were sensitive but not listed. But for some of our other case studies, there was really this kind of push and pull between the Wilderness Act and the Endangered Species Act and which actions for which act should be prioritized. And so do we consider trammeling in wilderness for the sake of trying to restore or conserve threatened and endangered species such as whitebark pine was a big one that generated a lot of this discussion. And so there is still a need for more research and clarity surrounding the intersection of those two acts and how we can make decisions under those different legal frameworks. Thank you.
Yeah, and with that, thank you so much. We're ready for questions.
Yay! Thank you both so much. That was a lot. It was an incredibly detailed and very interesting presentation. So we don't have any questions in the chat as of this moment. So if folks want to, yep, as MTS says, you should be able to unmute and ask a question yourself if you would like. If people start kind of piling up, let's start like using the raise hand function when you so that we can kind of queue people up that way. I'll give folks a second and then otherwise I will jump in. Okay, well, I will just go ahead and start then because I have a whole bunch of questions that I was writing down. I have a question about the process, and I know you kind of got a little bit into this at sort of the end, but I'm wondering if you found that did you notice any sort of like maybe difference in kind of like a before and after, like if folks like kind of went into the process, maybe like having a preference for a particular like resist, accept, direct, or a particular action, and then like afterward having gone through this process, if they maybe like had a different point of view of that, or if they had like changed some stuff, like thinking about kind of all of those trade-offs, or did you notice anything like that?
Um, Kara, I'm interested to hear what you say. You know, we didn't introduce RAD to very many people before starting the process. You know, some of our key project partners from the outset were familiar with the framework to some extent, but a lot of people weren't. Um, and so we did have, you know, we did have some individuals who were much more risk averse when it comes to directing change and just wanting more and more information. So, you know, what was really interesting to see was when we presented our scientific, you know, our biological findings from our modeling efforts or our team of experts, you know, how people responded to that. Were they skeptical? Did they think that was enough information to maybe change how they were thinking about it before? So that was really interesting to see. And some people were much more receptive to those findings than others.
Yeah. And I would say kind of the background and environment that folks came from, both early on in the project development as well as during the workshop, really influenced kind of their mindset, it seemed, going in. So wilderness managers, which not as much within this case study, but within the whitebark pine case study, we had a number of wilderness program managers who participated in that workshop, who were very resistant to resist indirect strategies because of their inclusion of active management. However, during the course of the workshop, seemed to be a little bit more understanding of perhaps the necessity, particularly for whitebark pine, because it's now a listed species, it's a threatened species throughout its range, that there might be a time and place where we could engage in active management, or where that would be necessary and when it would be necessary and at what scales. We're continuing to have these conversations after this project has concluded, but that was a situation where I felt that managers, wilderness managers in particular, seem to gain a little bit more awareness or understanding of the threat or problem of ecological transformation as a whole to whitebark pine communities, and the potential need to address those challenges or threats through active management. However, there's still that give and take, that push and pull of trying to conserve natural properties and reduce the amount of trammeling that we have on the landscape. For the biological science analyses in particular, kind of across the board, there was still some hesitancy. So we engaged in sort of a range of different biological science analyses across case studies, from this example where we did look at climate change projections and then tried to infer how those would impact conditions on the ground, to full quantitative analyses and projections, including different management scenarios and how those might interact with future climate to produce different future outcomes. So we kind of had a range of different analyses that we introduced across our case studies. And across the board, it was a little bit mixed. Again, I think dependent on people's backgrounds. For example, the Sonoran pronghorn case study, again, that's a federally endangered species. There were some managers that wanted to continue to resist no matter what. So they wanted to do everything they could to conserve that population where they occur within their historical range for as long as possible, even after our models indicated that habitat for that species was going to shift into the future. There was still this desire, particularly for managers that had been working or specialized on the species for decades, to continue to do what they were doing today. But there was some gradual recognition, again, that those activities might not be effective or produce the same results in the future. So engaging in those discussions of, well, how might things change, and how might that influence our management direction moving forward was something that I think what were interesting conversations to have with managers, and kind of, I think, expanded the decision space that they had previously. And so instead of just being so hyper focused on resisting and conserving in place, it was more expanded that decision space to include potential options to look at habitat in other areas outside of their historical range and accept change in some places in their range, which can be really difficult. So really varied kind of across case studies, but there definitely was a little bit of change in kind of the topic of conversation and how people were thinking about and their range of options to address these problems throughout the course of the workshop.
Yeah. Okay. And that's actually kind of a good segue into the next question. So, Joel Smith is asking, if there was a reason that only managers were included in, or like what other partners were included in some of these workshops. So like, did you think about including like commercial interests, like professional recreation, the, or yeah, or just like people that live nearby in gateway communities or folks like that?
It was generally focused on the management community, and that did include some key partners and rights holders were relevant. So, again, but people who are very active in the stewardship of these places. So, for this case study, like I said, we had nonprofit folks from Society for Wilderness Stewardship involved who are actively doing internships and stuff on the landscape and helping with projects and decision making. We also had folks from their Friends of organization there. For some of our other case studies, like White Pine, that was a Forest Service focused case study, but we had folks from National Park Service. We had folks from the Blackfeet Nation and from Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes. I see that
Yeah, Mike was on
Mike
here. He
jumped
had to.
off. Yeah, but he was there too, right? We also had White Bark Pine Ecosystem Foundation folks and American Forests, so other nonprofit organizations. But yeah, really the audience was people focused on making stewardship decisions as opposed to the public or communities that use the landscapes. But that would be a really interesting future direction to go in, right? And how those perspectives might be similar or different.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that. So Sophia Gilbert Smith is asking, is RAD designed to be a single focus model due to the complexity of the futures wheels? Or would this process be a good model to use for multi-species issues or maybe even like landscape scale issues?
Yeah, Kara can take kind of the second piece of that. But folks within Fish and Wildlife Service who we partnered with on the Sonoran Pronghorn case study, we're starting to look at how do you use RAD for multiple species, or how are you considering multiple species? Our way of doing that in this work was through the futures wheel, right? Like understanding that our decisions, everything is connected. So what does this resist action look like for the target transformation species? And then what does that mean for the surrounding social ecological system? But we invited Cordy Diggins, is a Fish Wildlife Service person who was at our Fish Wildlife Service workshop and helped us plan that. And we kind of designed that one to do a little bit more consideration of other species of concern within the wildlife refuges where these actions may take place.
Wonderful. And we're almost at the top of the hour. So, Kira, if you have something quick to add, go for it. And then we'll go to our informal session.
Yeah, just real quick, and we can jump over. Our case studies did cover kind of a range of spatial scales. Some were really large landscape level, and some were quite small, like our native amphibian habitat within the Black Ridge Canyons wilderness. But white bark pine was pretty much the entire western United States at appropriate elevations. So this tool can be applied across larger landscapes. And kind of help expand a decision space for larger landscapes as well. I think managers struggled a little bit when you're thinking about actions within wilderness to kind of blanket assign a resist strategy across the entire range. But RAD can be flexible and be used at smaller scales within that larger range. So you might choose to resist in some localities, accept in others, and direct in others. So it can be used, different strategies within that tool can be used differently in different places at the same time.
Excellent. Well, thank you both so much. I really appreciate it. I'm going to stop the recording now.